So, I decided to make a hoop skirt. Hoop skirts have been used throughout the centuries to get dramatic silhouettes. Hoop skirts are now mainly used under mid-length skirts to give more volume, but today I will be making a full-length hoop skirt. This is a start of a project that I am very excited for. It's probably a little bit early to talk about Ren Fair outfits, but I plan on going to the Celtic Christmas weekend at the Houston Ren Fair. Last year I won the costume contest during the Highland Games weekend, but I feel like I could do better, and this year I want to make every part of my costume, besides the shoes. I've created a little sketch of the outfit plan. I can't say it's the most detailed, but I do think it'll come together nicely. But for this outfit, I plan on making a hoop skirt, a petticoat, an underskirt, an overskirt, a corset, a shirt with boning, a cloak, and maybe a headpiece if I have enough time for that. I'm not sure how time intensive this project will be. So to start off this project, I'm making the hoop skirt. So to start off any good project, I got the materials. However, these materials were surprisingly expensive, around $150, but that total mostly came from the 34 yards of boning I had to get. I don't think I've ever had to get that many yards of any fabric, let alone boning. I found the cheapest boning I could find on eBay for around $30, but that still came to a total of like $90. The other materials I got were ribbon, bias tape, boning cutters, and twill tape. Given that this is my first time making a hoop skirt, I decided to get a pattern to follow. This is the only part of the outfit that I'm getting an actual pattern for. The rest will be patterned by me. We'll see how that goes. But I got this specific hoop skirt from Bella May's Designs on YouTube, which you should go and check out her stuff. She's great. This pattern comes from her videos recreating the Cinderella live action dress, and while I'm not trying to get the exact silhouette of that dress, the general shape and functionality of the hoop skirt is perfect for this project. But before I could do anything, I had to deal with the decision I made to save money, and that was not getting pre-made boning channels. Now, boning channels are usually built into the garment, right? You don't usually need to get pre-made ones. But when you're dealing with 34 yards of boning, most people don't really want to deal with 34 yards of boning channels. But online, those boning channels are quite expensive. So instead, I decided to use bias tape. Bias tape is great for its sturdiness and reluctance to stretch, and it was relatively cheap. I got around 30 yards for, I think, $10, $20. My boning was around half an inch wide, so I got 1 inch wide bias tape, which worked really well for it. I gave it enough wiggle room so that I could move the boning around if I needed to, which I did need to a little bit, but I could also make it as tight as I wanted. The large amount of boning channels that I had to sew meant that I spent around 5 hours just sewing the boning channels. And it's not a complicated process per se, but it was quite tedious. It's just sewing straight, but I was falling asleep. But after I got all the boning channels done and all the ribbon cut, it was time to finally put it all together on the dress form. Please don't pay attention to the messy floor. I had just made a kilt for my boyfriend. I'm also making his outfit. And the kilt decided to shed a lot. I would have vacuumed it before starting the hoop skirt, but I was cutting the ribbon and I did not know this before starting. I had never really used ribbon before in any sewing project, at least not to this extent, and so I didn't realize how much ribbon would fray. Now I know. Now I know the tips and tricks of nail polish and burning the edges, but I was unaware of this beforehand, and so I got all over the floor anyways. Even more of a mess. So I decided to wait to vacuum until after. I was mostly going off of the design from Bella May's Designs, but I tweaked it a little bit to better suit my preferences. One of the reasons why I specifically chose this skirt pattern was because of the functionality. This pattern has little handles at the front. which will be very, very useful for getting around at the Ren Fair. Because, Ren fairs aren't exactly known to be the most easily traversable. They're not hard to get around, but I've also never walked around with a full hoop skirt and a full corset and a full everything. So I'm trying to make it easier for myself. Now, most of the changes that I made to the pattern had to do with making the bottom 5 hoops smaller. I kept all the U-boning, which is the boning that's not parallel to the ground, the same, but this caused a little bit of a problem. So I'm not bad at math, right? But to change the measurements of a garment, I usually need to understand the fundamentals of how it works. In changing the measurements on a garment where measurements are everything was harder than I imagined it to be. Also, if I haven't mentioned this already, this is not a tutorial. You are here to watch me struggle or to see me suffer. There are plenty of other videos on YouTube from people who actually know what they're doing, like Bella Mae's Designs. So if you want a tutorial, I would say go look at their channels. I will give some tips that I learned as a first-time hoop making person, but I'm definitely not an expert. So, putting that out there. So now to get back to the hoop skirt. By this point, it was coming along pretty nicely. Not as neat as I had hoped, but also not as bad as I had feared. However, I had made a grave miscalculation due to nothing but my own stupidity. That right there is the face of someone who hasn't yet realized there should be 12 ribbons on the waistband and not 6. On the diagram, there were ribbons labeled A, B, C, D, E, and F. I thought that those were the entirety of the ribbons that were going to be on the waistband, right? 6 in total. No, that was half of the ribbons. You were supposed to mirror it on the other side, which makes much more sense now. It was obvious in the pattern, but instead, I had put all the weight of the boning on half the ribbon required. So of course, it's no surprise that they failed halfway through. I didn't get a video of this. I meant to, but I guess I just forgot. So here's how I fixed it. The main issue was that there wasn't enough ribbons to hold up the weight of the boning. And looking back at the pattern and realizing my mistake, that was obvious. Now, when cutting the ribbon, the pattern had specifically requested 1/2-inch wide ribbon, but I used 1-inch wide to save money. If you see, there's a through line here of me saving money. But as I mentioned before, I had never used ribbon in an actual sewing project before. So I had no idea how much it was gonna fray. And so I cut each ribbon in half to make that 1/2-inch wide. And so it was fraying from every angle possible. And I know now how to fix that. I have been made aware by my own searching. It was right there. It's easy to search out. Anyways, my solution was to use the full 1-inch wide ribbons and put them in the places where the other ribbons should have gone. I had spaced them out in my head myself because, again, it didn't make sense how all those 6 ribbons were supposed to wrap around like that with the angles it specified, which makes sense. It didn't. And so I put the 1-inch ribbons where they were supposed to go. I had spent too much time on placing the boning in the correct positions on the original ribbon, especially since I was winging it with the measurements. And so I kept those ribbons on there, I just added in new ones. But adding on the extra ribbons seemed to help with the heaviness problem. They didn't fall apart for the rest of the project, and they still haven't fallen apart, which is great. And so I repainted all of the dress form and kept going. Now that that issue was settled, I kept putting out the hoop skirt, finishing up the U-boning, and putting everything where it needed to be. Here's a tip. I would highly suggest that you sew all your ribbons onto your waistband before you put any of the boning on. Alright, it's not mandatory. It's not going to ruin anything if you don't. It gives you more control if you don't. But if you're following a pattern, if you already know where those ribbons are going to stay, if you're not going to move those ribbons, just sew them on. It makes it so much easier. It's much easier to use a sewing machine, not being attached to a huge hoop skirt, especially a full-length one, right? Maybe with the half-length hoop skirt, it might be a little bit easier to manage. You'll see later why this was an issue, so just do it beforehand. You don't have to, but it just makes it a whole lot easier. Also, these clips that I'm using were really useful for keeping the boning in place. They were much easier to use than pins, mostly because, you just clip, and they seem to hold more weight. I had 100 of them at the start. Now I have 99 since the first one I decided to use broke. But the rest are still there and working. So if you want to get anything that I used in this video, I'll put everything that I bought online in the description. Now we can finally move on from putting things together to sewing it together. I wanted to make sure to break the least amount of needles as possible on my sewing machine. And so I made the decision, I regret that decision, to hand sew it all. Yes, if you want to know how long that poor decision took me to do, it took me around 13 hours. I have never felt as much back pain as I have felt sewing this hoop skirt. There was no position I could get comfortable in. It's at a weird angle. Most of them are on the floor, so it's not even like I can stand up. I have scoliosis, which isn't usually a problem, but it became a problem here. I have never felt older. And I'm not old. I don't think so. I hope not. I'm 20. Anyway, so if you are doing this at home, first of all, you should not be following this video. But please just use a sewing machine. Alright, please. It is there for a reason. If you do not have a sewing machine, that's a different issue. But if you have a sewing machine, use it. You do have to be careful with the boning. You go over that boning, the needle is not going to win. So wear eye protection, be careful. But it's just so much faster, so much easier. Alright, and I have pricked myself more times on this project than I've pricked myself with any other project. I had to put a band-aid on my finger because I'd taken off the skin. So just use a sewing machine. Some parts will need to be hand sewn, but in general, it can mostly be done with a sewing machine. It can, I promise. So anyways, here is a time lapse of me hand sewing this hoop skirt together. On that note, it's time for another tip. You want your boning channels to be around 1 to 2 inches longer than your boning. This is so that you have extra space to sew it together, as that's what you're doing. It makes it more comfortable. You can actually, make the boning stay in place that way. You can stop it from shuffling around. There's a lot of good things that come with having extra boning channel width. And always cut it off later if you don't need it. Easy as that. And I say that because I did not do that. I should have. There's a lot of things I should have done here. Please do that. Alright? It makes it just so much easier. It's just so much easier. The reason I didn't do that was, again, I was being cheap. I got 30 yards of bias tape because it came in 30 yards, and I needed 34 yards. That was the magic number, and it only came in 30-yard rolls, like the cheap stuff, and I didn't want to spend another $10 another roll, and so I just decided to go without it, saying I could live without it. You can't live without it. Spend the extra $5 to $10. Go to a random fabric store. They'll sell it. Just get that extra stuff. I resorted to the front handles being ribbon. That's why it's like that. I know the reason why. It looks a little bit off if you don't know why. So the front handles are made of ribbon because I completely ran out of bias tape. And not only that, I made the bias tape the exact same length as my boning. Which means that when it was time to sew it closed, can't see all of them are sewn closed completely, but they're not moving. So I can hope and pray that it stays together. We're finally getting into the home stretch of this hoop skirt. I thought this would be the easiest part because my original plan was to use a sewing machine to sew together the waistband, I was gonna have twill tape as a waistband with the ribbon across it. Sew down the middle, easy peasy. Put on another layer of twill tape, make it neater, make it sturdier, and be done with it. Maybe an hour max, probably 30 minutes. I'm not gonna show you the sad process of me trying to use the sewing machine with the waistband attached to the amalgamation of boning, but it was bad. All right, I spent an hour trying to get it to work. It didn't work. Or I resorted to, yet again, another show of hand sewing. That's the tagline for this entire project. It's just hand sewing, and I wish it wasn't. I hate hand sewing. And I'd say I would be done with hand sewing for the rest of the project, but I plan on embroidering a lot of this stuff. Anyway, that did mean, though, that instead of maybe an hour more of work, I had 4 more hours of work. Before that, though, since I was done messing with the ribbon, mostly, I decided it was a good time to finally vacuum. Oh, it felt so good to get all those little strings off the ground. I kept standing up. After standing on the floor, I was covered in them. I think I breathed in more ribbon string than air in that room. Here we are again, hand sewing yet another part of this hoop skirt. Some of the ribbons were frayed pretty badly at the top, and so I had like 5 inches left of bias tape to help the ribbons stay together. I added that to the top of some of the ribbons, around 4 of them. It helped a lot to keep them together, even though half of the ribbons are not attached to the top of the waistband anymore. After sewing bias tape on the 4 ribbons, I sewed all the ribbons down to the waistband. I went over them twice. There was no way that I was gonna chance these falling off again. And after that, it was time for the final layer of twill tape. Now, this took longer than I expected it to. I probably didn't need to spend as much time at this stage, but I really wanted to make sure it stood together. And so I went over the entire edge twice, which it still worked. I had never actually used twill tape as a standalone waistband before. There's a lot of things I haven't done before in this project. A lot of new things, great. But I didn't realize how easy it was to sew through. And so I kept poking myself specifically doing this waistband. And once I finished putting a lot together, I decided to try it on for the first time. I wanted to try it on before putting the closures on. 1, make sure it actually fit, and 2, to make sure that it can be roughened up without falling apart. Since I was so afraid of the ribbon fraying and breaking off of the actual waistband on the dress form, I didn't really shake it that much. I shaked the bottom a little bit, but I didn't really sway it or hop with it. I didn't rough it up enough to know if it's actually put together correctly. The test went well, and so it was time for the closures. I used 3 hook and eye closures. 1 at the top, 1 in the middle, 1 at the bottom. After that was done, I decided to add some bows to the front. No real reason behind it, it's just my preference. I know it won't actually be seen by anyone when the full outfit is on, but I'll know it's there, and that's what matters. And so will you. A lot of things went wrong, but I think the end product looks great. I am happy with it. It works as a hoop skirt, which is the most important thing, and even if it's not perfectly neat, it is hidden underneath multiple layers of fabric. This was my first time using boning in any sewing project, and I can confidently say that I am much more comfortable with boning after this project, which is great because I'll be using boning in my corset and my shirt. I have many things that I would do differently, but I think that's the best way to end a project. You know, and hopefully the next hoop skirt that I make will be less stressful. My suffering field lessons do not only apply to me, so here are a few tips that I learned while making the hoop skirt. 1, make sure to allow for at least 1 to 2 inches of overlap for your boning, specifically for the hoop boning. I didn't know this. It seems like common sense now, but if you don't allow for that overlap in the front, it becomes more like a teardrop shape. And that wasn't a problem for me because I had already made them a little bit longer just in case I wanted to make it bigger. But if I had made them to my exact measurements, that would have been a problem. So just make them a couple inches longer. It'll secure that sugar boning. It's just a little bit easier. 2, burn the edges of any ribbon that you cut or use nail polish, whatever you do to stop it from fraying. Please. I've probably just been living under a rock, but just please, if you're gonna use ribbon, if in anything, burn those edges right. 3, if you want to simplify the process, sew on your ribbons before you put on any boning. This isn't a rule that you need to follow. None of these are rules that you need to follow, but this just, if you want to make it simpler for yourself, if you're not an expert, if you're not going to be moving those after you put them on, I didn't, then just sew them on before you get all that extra stuff on there, before it'll become a hassle getting into the sewing machine. Just use it. And that brings us into our next tip. Tip number 4, use the sewing machine. Just please use the sewing machine. It is not worth it. I spent an extra, 18 hours just from hand sewing. I did not need to spend that much time on this. And I'll never spend that much time on a hoop skirt again. And you don't have to either, just use the sewing machine. However, if you are going to, make sure to wear eye protection, please. We don't want any stray, random needles getting into anyone's eyes because they burn out the boning, all right? We don't want that. And 5, this one isn't as important as the others, but it's just something I noticed. If you've never gotten this amount of boning before, because, well, you know I've never used boning before, but specifically when it's coiled up, mine came in little zip ties around the coil. And again, this seems like common sense, but please hold it when you're cutting the zip tie, because I didn't, and I got hit in the face with the boning. And also, don't let it just fly everywhere. Don't just let go of it when you're trying to, measure it, since you have to let it unravel to measure. I did that the first time, and it managed to hit me again, so please just be careful. And with those final tips, the hoop skirt has been complete. The next project for this outfit will be the petticoat, which I am really excited for. I got over 7 yards of white fabric for this. I'm gonna be ruffling, and I'm going to be gathering, and I have a bunch of cotton cord to use. It'll be great. It'll probably make it look way more fun, right? Fluffy skirts. I love fluffy skirts. But until then, I hope you have fun creating. And if you're not creating, I hope you've had fun watching, and I will see you next time.